This message was originally preached at the Vine Church in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada on Sunday, February the 8th, 2026, as part of the series Obstacles and Opportunities. For the past few weeks, we've been exploring together the obstacles that God's people face. We took a look at physical obstacles, such as the Red Sea, that without God's intervention would have kept the Israelites from moving forward. Then we considered last week inner obstacles, using Gideon as an example, because his inner struggles fed his reluctance to be the warrior that God intended him to be. Today, we'll explore what may seem like the most difficult type of obstacle that we can encounter, and that is one that is spiritual in nature. I've chosen as my example today the Apostle Paul and his thorn in the flesh, Paul's spiritual battle. And we can read about it in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10. So today we consider the topic when the enemy attacks. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10 says this. And this is Paul speaking, and he says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." When the enemy attacks, some obstacles don't go away. They don't part like the Red Sea. They don't shrink like Gideon's fear. They stay, and they are relentless. Paul calls his obstacle a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. This is not a minor irritation, then. This is a spiritual attack with physical and emotional consequences. Let's zoom in on Paul's experience, and I want us to highlight 5 things: pain, pleading, purpose, provision, and perspective. As we look at Paul's experience and these 5 things that he went through, I think we can have a greater understanding of how opportunity can come even out of spiritual attack. So first of all, let's notice pain. Let's talk about Paul's pain. Paul talks about having a thorn in the flesh. Now, let me come out of the gate insisting that Paul's thorn was indeed demonic in nature. I've heard a lot of preachers preaching on this passage, and I've heard a lot of preachers and pastors speculate about what Paul's thorn may have been. Some speculate that it was physical illness like malaria that even perhaps affected the joints in his body and his ability to travel. Some say that he lost his eyesight, and it is true. In Galatians, it appears that Paul had to write in his own writing was very large, which indicates he must have had poor eyesight. Some say it was some enemy that was seeking to assassinate him, or maybe a group of enemies. And others say that Paul's thorn in the flesh was an ongoing temptation or testing of his faith. Well, all of these are reasonable assumptions, and they may all be true. But Paul tells us exactly what his thorn in the flesh was. He calls this obstacle a messenger of Satan. He says, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. Literally, there was a demon who was attacking Paul, an evil spiritual entity, and it was very painful. Paul likens it to being stabbed with a thorn. And by the way, I don't think of a thorn that Paul's talking about as a little sliver, but more like a dagger. Paul also said that this messenger of Satan, this thorn in the flesh, was sent to buffet him. The word buffet in the Greek is kalaphizo, and it literally means to punch with the knuckles or to continually pound with your fist. I read one commentator who suggests that combined with the thorn, the meaning of this is striking with something very sharp and painful, sticking it deeply into the flesh so it remains there. So Paul was being stabbed, punched and stabbed by his thorn in the flesh. Now, was the pain that Paul felt physical or spiritual? Well, he may have felt it physically. I think he did, but it was from a spiritual source. Now, Paul doesn't really describe the pain exactly what it was, but we know this. The pain was very real. Paul felt real pain, emotional pain, perhaps spiritual pain. And of course, I think he felt physical pain, which brings us to Paul's response, pleading. Paul says that he begged God 3 times for God. 3 times, he says, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. I couldn't help but ask as I was reading this, what is the significance of 3 times? Why does Paul say that he prayed 3 times? Maybe, didn't he pray more than that? Well, we can look at the example of Jesus. We see that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed 3 times specifically for the pain, the spiritual pain, and the attack he was feeling as he was preparing to go to the cross. Now, some commentators suggest that 3 times may be an idiom for completeness. 3 times is complete. Now, I don't think it's saying that Paul just prayed 3 times very quickly in a row. Like, I don't think Paul said, Jesus, take this thorn away. Jesus, take this thorn away. Jesus, take this thorn away. And then he was done. No, Paul made his case before the Lord. I think that 3 times is kind of showing that he was very thorough on 3 separate occasions. Paul agonized and pleaded with God for relief. So I think that's the idea of the 3 times, that he completely made his case before the Lord. He kept praying and praying about the situation until God said to him, that's enough, Paul. I'm not taking it away. I've got something better for you. So we see Paul's pain, we see his pleading, but why? Why was Paul being attacked by a demon? Well, let's notice the purpose. And believe it or not, Paul knew why he was suffering. He actually knew he was suffering. Paul had the rare privilege of knowing exactly why he was under attack. Now, we often, I think most of the time, we don't know for sure why we are under spiritual attack. We just have to simply submit to the fact that God has his reasons for allowing stuff to happen. But Paul knew that he was being attacked so that he would remain humble. Notice what he says. He actually says it twice in verse 7, and lest I should be exalted above measure. And he ends that sentence, that long sentence, by saying, lest I be exalted above measure. He actually says it twice. Paul says that he was attacked demonically by this spiritual evil entity in order to keep him humble. You see, in the previous verses in chapter 12, verses 1 and 6, Paul talks about this supernatural experience that happened to him. Well, he says, I knew a man that went up into the 3rd heaven. But when you read it in context, it's pretty obvious that Paul is talking about himself, especially when you tie it in to our text today, when he talks about his revelations, that he didn't want to be exalted because of his excessive revelation. So anyway, Paul talks about a man himself who went into the 3rd heaven. He actually went to heaven, and There was an occasion when Paul was stoned by his enemies and left for dead. You can read about that in Acts 14. Perhaps that's when he actually died and briefly went to heaven, and then God brought him back to his body. We don't know for sure, but we know this. Paul, whether in the body or spiritually, went to heaven and he saw things that he couldn't even explain. And he had these huge revelations of what heaven and what the spiritual realm is like. But the point Paul is making is that in order to keep him from being big-headed about his experiences, lest he should be exalted, he said, God allowed him. God did not attack him. God allowed him, though, to be attacked. Now, unlike Paul, we may never know why we are under spiritual attack. It just might be something that God never reveals to us. But there are three things that I think we should remember when we are under spiritual attack. And that is that God never allows pain without a purpose. In other words, God has a reason for allowing us to be attacked, just like he had a reason for allowing Paul to have his thorn in the flesh. God never allows pain into our life without a purpose. And another important thing to remember is that humility, a humble attitude, will help us get through it. Notice Paul's very humble attitude. He's saying, I don't need to be exalted. And his approach to this pain was with great humility. And then another thing that we should remember is your pain won't last forever. It's not going to last forever. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And so pain doesn't always last forever. Sometimes it feels like it, but it doesn't. And so there's a purpose to it. When we are under attack, there's a purpose to it. Whether we know it, like Paul, or not, there's a purpose to it. So we've seen Paul's pain, the pleading, the purpose. And besides, if God won't remove our thorn, then he will. And this brings us to our fourth point, provision. God has something better in mind. God said to Paul that he had something better in mind for him. God doesn't always answer prayers the way that we think he should. He doesn't always answer prayers our way. Sometimes he says yes, and he does deliver us from the obstacles we face. But sometimes he says no. But Paul learned this the hard way, but the gracious way, as God said, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. Now, I want to share a principle with you that I found very trustworthy in my life as a follower of Jesus Christ. When God says no to something, it actually means he's saying yes to something better. God gives us a replacement for the pain. When God says no to something, it really means he is saying yes to something better. God's grace was way better than taking away Paul's thorn, believe it or not. God's grace can get us through anything. That's why God assures Paul, he says, for my power is made perfect in weakness. When we are under attack, the pain of it can feel unrelenting. And by the way, just because I said that Paul's battle was spiritual, I didn't mean to say that he didn't experience physical pain. I think he experienced physical pain, and that's why he likened it to a thorn. What does he say? He had a thorn in the flesh. So he felt it in his flesh. Paul wasn't just pummeled mentally. He wasn't buffeted just spiritually, but in his body as well. And yet, Paul concludes, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships, persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You see, weakness and struggling can actually be good for us. We don't like to hear that, do we? But it's true. Troubles make us stronger. And truth be told, sometimes it's not good for our struggles to be removed. Sometimes we will actually end up weaker if our struggles are taken away from us. I remember the old story of the emperor moth. In her devotional book, Streams in the Desert, L.B. Cowman tells the story of caring for an emperor moth for almost a year till it began to finally struggle to break out of its cocoon. Well, thinking that she would help this imprisoned creature, she took a pair of scissors and she snipped off the bottom of the cocoon. What a big mistake. And she writes later, my misplaced tenderness had proven to be its ruin. The moth suffered an aborted life, crawling painfully through its brief existence instead of flying through the air on rainbow wings. You see, it's the struggle to get out that makes the moth strong enough to fly. As it's struggling to get out, the blood is forced into its wings, and its wings system becomes stronger. And by the time it finally gets through struggling, it's got enough strength in its wings, it's got enough blood flowing through its entire body that it can fly. So what really makes us stronger, though, is not really the struggle itself, but rather the strength that God gives us through the struggle. Still, struggles can be and should be good for us. Well, we've seen Paul's pain, the purpose of his pain, and his pleading, his provision from God. Now let's look at the final thought, the perspective. Learning to look at trials differently. We really need to learn to look at our struggles, to look at our trials differently. And it's taken me 4 sermons up to this point for me to drill this point down, that if we learn anything from the Apostle Paul, it's that every obstacle is an opportunity. I want you to write that down somewhere. Put it up on your wall somewhere where you'll see it every day. Every obstacle is an opportunity. Every hardship we face, physical and emotional and even spiritual struggles, are opportunities to grow closer to God and to glean incredible strength that we would never know that we had. So here's the bottom line, my friends. Listen to me. Here's the bottom line. Let's look at obstacles differently. Instead of remaining hopeless and helpless with our struggles, our obstacles that we come across, we should ask ourselves 2 very important questions. 1, what can I learn from this? Let the struggle teach you. And how can this strengthen my faith? And remember, as Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, which he says through his own experiences, he experienced this himself, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. In closing, Paul's experience teaches us that God can turn obstacles into opportunities. Spiritual obstacles, including demonic attack, are actually opportunities for us to trust in God for strength. Instead of viewing our weaknesses as defeats, we are invited to see them as places where God's grace and power can shine more brightly. We may never fully understand why we face certain battles, but we can trust that God is at work, transforming our struggles into opportunities for humility, for growth, for a deeper reliance on him. May I close with just a quick prayer? And if you're struggling with any kind of obstacle in your life, as we've talked about physical obstacles, internal obstacles that would cause us to self-sabotage, or spiritual obstacles, being spiritually under attack, whatever the obstacle may be, may I share this prayer with you, especially if you're a believer. Claim this in Jesus' name. Gracious Father, thank you for your unfailing presence in every trial I face. When I am weak, remind me that your strength is limitless. Help me to trust you, to see every hardship as an opportunity for growth. and deeper faith in you. May your power rest upon me, and may I walk forward in hope, courage, and humility, knowing that all things are working together for my good in Jesus' name. May the Lord bless you, and may every obstacle you face truly be turned into a magnificent opportunity.